you identify? How do you ID? Are you something fashion wild? Talk to me, talk to me. I want to objectify. I want to object. Are you something fashion free? Talk to me, talk to me.
Hi, welcome. My name is Michael Boykowski. I've been a working designer for around 3 decades now, with a variety of clients and collaborators in Australia, as well as in the UK and the Netherlands. In 2020, I graduated from the Critical Inquiry Lab MA program, formerly known as Design Writing and Curation, at Design Academy Eindhoven in the Netherlands. You can find out more about my practice by visiting okinterrupt.website. References for this presentation will be available via Are.na. A secure link to a dedicated Are.na channel will be circulated via Canvas, so keep an eye out for that. So to begin, does this pink triangle look familiar? Do you know what it signifies or stands for? If we do a really quick visual analysis, what can we discern? So it's pink, it's triangular, but what else? How can it be described? We can say that the triangle has equal sides. It's not one of those triangles that sort of looks like it's distorted. It has equal sides. It's equilateral. Lateral, which speaks of equality. It's the triangle is also a non-binary form, so that just means it has three sides. It avoids having a duality. It takes three sides to make it up. The color looks very close to magenta, which is a easily accessible print color. It's one of the print colors that make up every other sort of images you see in publications. Easily accessible ink color, and it also means you can get like a really saturated, blocky, sort of really intense color out of it. It's also close to, just looking at it, like a fluorescent color maybe. I actually know that it is PMS 212C, which isn't magenta or fluorescent, but you could easily substitute it for any of these. I don't think that's how you spell fluorescent. Who knows? The other thing, it reminds me of the Bass Brewery logo, which is significant because it's an example of like a sort of contemporary form of identity work or branding. Reminds me of a sort of the logo, but is seen as one of the first examples. So it was first registered in the 1800s. So there's a link to sort of the practice of branding and identity work going as far back as like, the late 1800s. If we look at the way that it's presented too, it's sort of like a triangle is floating in a dark void, lighting the space. So it's kind of like an illumination in this sort of black mass or black void. This is just a few of the things I think are noticeable. We could keep going and going, but maybe if you want to do your own visual analysis, you could have a go. So what this pink triangle is probably best known for today is symbolizing queer protest. and in particular protests that occurred in the mid-1980s in the United States at a time when the general public were becoming aware of the AIDS pandemic. This recognition stemming from the Silence Equals Death poster shown in this image. And the man holding this poster is designer and activist Avram Finkelstein, seen here in his home in 2016. The text at the bottom of the poster reads, "Why is Reagan," as in Ronald Reagan, former President of the United States, "why is Reagan silent about AIDS? What is really going on at the Center for Disease Control, the Federal Drug Administration, and the Vatican? Gays and lesbians are not expendable. Use your power. Vote, boycott, defend yourselves. Turn anger, fear, and grief into action." And that's all written along the bottom of the poster underneath where it says "Silence Equals Death." Finkelstein was originally credited with having designed this poster as part of an AIDS awareness organization called ACT UP, although he would go on to relinquish credit for the design in favor of crediting ACT UP as the group who initiated it in the first place. And he explains why in an interview in 2013 for the New York Public Library's blog. In this interview, he says, "As a founding member of the political collective that produced the image most closely associated with AIDS activism, I'm frequently asked to speak about this poster. People have thanked me for it, telling me the poster was the rallying cry that drew them to political activism." And he says, "I have a different take on that." And he goes on to say, "In essence and intention, the political poster is a public thing. It comes to life in the public sphere and is academic outside of it. Individuals design it, or agencies, or governments, but it belongs to those who respond to its call." And Finkelstein continues, "I would argue that it was the AIDS activist community that created it, a community in search of its voice, one that went on to find it through the activation of its own social spaces." And he just concludes by saying, "This poster is a product of collective world making, the sort of collectivity which moves every one of us as individuals and as a culture and is transformative." The visual clarity and timing surrounding the Silence Equals Death poster and its positioning of the pink triangle at its heart would resonate well beyond its initial deployment. And shown here is a pamphlet, or rather a broadsheet newspaper, that was labelled "Queers Read This" and was distributed anonymously by hand at New York Gay Pride in 1990. It's a clear evolution of the Silence Equals Death identity, and an example of a poster forming a visual identity, in that the pink triangle is there. This time it's reversed out of the pink, and also the stark color palette is there of pink, black, and white. This time the graphic palette has been extended by referencing the look of style magazines at the time instead of advertising, which was a reference for the original poster. And Queers Read This borrows very much from ID magazine, whose art director Stephen Mayle had been experimenting with similar typefaces and overlaying of text at the same time. And this is a couple of layouts designed by Stephen Mayle for ID magazine around 1989. The Queers Read This pamphlet, or newspaper, was produced anonymously but linked to another protest group Avram Finkelstein was part of, this time called Anonymous Queers. And this is a photograph of Finkelstein handing out the newspapers during Gay Pride. This is a more recent example of the pink triangle, positioned literally at the center of this queer protest poster. And this is an image that was posted to Avram Finkelstein's Tumblr page in 2018, so only a few years ago. The Stonewall mentioned in the previous poster refers to the Stonewall riots in 1969, which would lead on to the formation of many queer, gay, and lesbian protest groups and the first gay pride rally to be held in the city of New York in 1970. These are some interesting badges associated with various gay and lesbian activist groups in the 70s and 80s. Do you recognize any of the graphic symbology used on any of these badges? Is anything here familiar? There's at least one instance which we will go on to talk about a bit more later. So if we examine Finkelstein's affiliations, several activist collectives that utilize design as a tool for protest come to the fore. Grand Fury is one such group he was involved with, alongside a host of designers and artists that together formed a creative network of collaborators. And shown here is a Grand Fury installation from 1990, highlighting the lack of support offered to homeless citizens with AIDS within New York's neighborhoods. And these signs. There was a few iterations of them, and they were sort of posted on the outside of this public park in New York, where homeless people gathered to often to sleep. This is another Grand Fury project. So this was called Wall Street Money, and these are US dollar bill shaped flyers that were produced by Grand Fury for ACT UP in 1988 and were distributed via protest rallies. And here are those same notes as they were displayed at a retrospective of Grand Fury's work held in London in 2018 on the occasion of the group's 13-year anniversary. Grand Fury's campaign work and that of the burgeoning communities of similar activist collectives in New York at the time would lead to the emergence of feminist collective The Guerrilla Girls, who propagated a similar shared design aesthetic which was stringently applied, and shown here is their most commonly recognized poster for a project initiated in 1989. And this same project continues to evolve today, and here are sort of various iterations that have occurred over the years, sometimes updating the data, sometimes translating it, sometimes both, in various shapes and forms and publishable containers. This is another Guerrilla Girls work called Dear Art Collector. This work began in 1986, and the latest iteration, which is on screen at the moment, is from 2013 and was addressed to Dear Interview magazine. So some quick questions to consider before we move on. What protest organizations and campaigns are you personally aware of? What design devices do they utilize to present a coherent or deliberately incoherent front? And how do they leverage design to their advantage? So just a few things to ponder or consider. If we refocus and go back to our pink triangle, this is a drawing made by artist Kang Seung Lee of a page from one of Finkelstein's notebooks, and it documents the design decisions made during group discussions while devising the visual approach for the Silence Equals Death poster. And the notes on these pages show that the group tested various things such as the visibility of various typefaces at distances that would be easily visible on the street. They discussed how the text should have an aggressive feeling of advertising, and they discussed options regarding the pink triangle as a unifying symbol for both gay men and lesbians, as well as possible alternatives to this symbol. An initial reference came in the form of the lowercase version of the Greek letter lambda. New York's Gay Activist Alliance had been using this symbol to denote community since the 1970s in the wake of the Stonewall riots. And you may have noticed this symbol on some of the badges that we looked at earlier. The pink triangle could be seen as a refinement of the lambda, but there was a more potent reference that gave participants pause for concern. First, a quick story. So the program I undertook in the Netherlands was primarily concerned with design, writing, and curation. As part of our studies, we were invited to the Design Museum Den Bosch to meet their new director and visit their main exhibition they were staging, which was called Design of the Third Reich. The show centered around designed artifacts from the Nazi era. The majority of these items and supporting displays were considered inflammatory enough for the museum to issue a ban on visitor photography. As much as the museum tried to dress the exhibition up as a critical analysis of design's role within the Nazi movement, much of the ensuing discussions focused on the incoming museum director's controversial statements he had made in the past, and the museum's need to expand their profile in order to attract funding. Being of Polish/Ukrainian ancestry and having one set of grandparents who had escaped Nazi occupation of Poland and another who hailed from the Jewish community in East London, I found the exhibition incredibly difficult to navigate, reaching a point at which an urge to leave the exhibition overwhelmed me. The museum had made its rather blunt point. If there was ever evidence of design's potential to be wielded as a weapon of oppression, this was where it was made evident. One of the examples noted in the exhibition came in the form of a badge code used to denote the status of Nazi prisoners. These badges, made of fabric and sewn into striped uniforms, adhered to a strict and clearly delineated graphic system. The system started with a co-opting of the Star of David, an ancient symbol that came to represent those of Jewish descent and faith. The interlocking triangles that made up the star were pulled apart and adapted to denote other prisoners designated as undesirable, including the homosexual, which is shown in the bottom corner. This was where ACT UP found the potent symbology they needed, and the reason there was much discussion over whether or not it was appropriate to use this as a reference. In order to reclaim the pink triangle and alter its perception from symbol of oppression to representing a unified front against similar ignorance and injustice, the symbol needed to be made queer. It needed to be pushed into a liminal space where it became pliable, where initial connotations could be examined and detached, and where new, fresh, renewed associations could then be forged. And protest turned out to be this space. As the Silence Equals Death poster became widely distributed and iterations of it made, the design motifs ACT UP decided to put into the public realm began to be rapidly utilized and expanded upon. A shared umbrella identity quickly formed, which I think you can see in this photograph from 1989. As an aside, in Nazi concentration camps, the pink triangle was mostly associated with male prisoners, with gay women more likely to be assigned the black triangle, which was a catch-all denoting social deviancy away from heteronormative expectations. More recently, the black triangle has been reclaimed by disability rights activists running against discrimination and concerns around ableism. So there are a couple of points that stood out as takeaways from my research around the pink triangle. The first one, that design isn't concrete, it's malleable. A design is not necessarily set in stone. It can change. It can be made different, and often is, whether that is the intent or not. A second takeaway for me was that a queer approach to the act of designing can open up liminal spaces in which to pick apart accepted dogma. Zooming forward to recent times, with the embedding of digital culture into our everyday lives, attention has turned to archives and collections, particularly those of institutions who have helped build and maintain established canons. And to sort of help explain what's meant by canons, shown here is a grid structure for a book design by Jan Tischhold, which has been described as the golden canon of page construction, and is one of many page layout examples that constitute a so-named canon of page construction. A questioning of the validity of said canons has opened up a space for new forms of activism. Activism that seeks to dissect and break up accepted hierarchies and make space for diverse and urgent voices that were previously excluded or pushed to the margins. So the canon is a place of exclusion as much as inclusion. And this gatekeeping is what is under increasing interrogation. And here we have an image from Sarah Carmen's text, Once Upon a Time, which provides an alternative tongue-in-cheek history of graphic design, and was featured in the Glossary of Undisciplined Design, edited by Anja Kaiser and Rebecca Stephanie, published last year. Designers as mediators of digital material have found themselves at the forefront of this new form of activism. For some, typography and typeface design has proved a useful container for a more expansive reading of designed legacies. There have been a couple of very recent projects initiated by design students that put typeface design to practical use as forms of activism and for building awareness. In this case, it's mostly centered around languages that are heavily gendered and therefore enforce exclusionary gender binaries. So the first one I want to mention is this one called Typo Hacks, which is by a designer called Hannah Witt. It's a project and resulting book about gender sensitivity specific to the German language. The book has been supported and published by German design magazine Form. And here are a couple of spreads from it. And this second project is called Bye Bye Binary, and it was initiated by a collective of French and Belgian designers and design students who have released a group of fonts that alter base character sets to create ungendered variations or new types of characters. And you can see an example of how they work here. So these are specific to French and Belgian languages. Nat Piper is a self-professed alphabet artist. In 2021, Piper produced a collection of fonts under the project Queer Year of Love Letters. And Piper goes on to explain, the series aims to make the act of remembering these overlooked and illegitimate histories accessible as easily as typing. It aims to make the act of typing an act of remembering. That these fonts might be considered typefaces is incidental. They are an attempt to improvise a clandestine lineage and a kind of queer kinship through the act of writing. Piper continues, I began making these fonts in order to rapidly document and disseminate the work and ideas that they cite. I pack these histories into fonts for a couple of reasons. First, font files are durable. OpenType fonts have persisted in their ubiquity since the late 1990s and maintain their utility as a nimble and reliable format. Second, fonts have the capacity to contain a hefty amount of information within a tiny package. In under 100 kilobytes, an entire alphabet can be included. In the font's metadata, a manifesto. Fonts then function as a useful format for ferrying information from one place to the other. And Piper goes on to say, I am using these fonts as time machines. These machines take us back. They take us back to Robert Ford and the Black Gay and Lesbian Underground Publishing in the early 90s in Chicago. They take us back to the Lesbian Alliance, a social feminist enclave in 1970s St. Louis, Missouri, to G.B. Jones and the queer punk filmmaking in 1980s downtown Toronto. But Piper says they also take me forward to unknown futures through the act of writing itself. In use, these fonts engage the past as provocation. They engage the past as a verb. Nat Piper is not the only creative in recent times to use fonts as containers for queer activism when questioning established archives and/or canons. Genderfail is the name given to the New York-based design and publishing practice of B. Oakley. Genderfail regularly utilizes a selection of deliberately rough and ready protest fonts in their work, each font relating to a specific event or moment in the legacy of queer and other forms of activism. So as an example, this is a poster for a Genderfail protest font built out of letter forms extracted from photographs of process signs as they appeared at various ACT UP rallies over the years. And this is a font and poster that captures letterforms used on banners photographed at Black Trans Lives Matters protests. And these typefaces are all free to download as long as you're not using them for commercial purposes. It's a Genderfail font with the rather lengthy title of If I Die of AIDS, Forget Burial, Just Drop My Body on the Steps of the FDA Regular. That's the full title. That leads us to the broader question of design's role within protest and activism, and also takes us back to where we started with ACT UP and the Pink Triangle. As Paul Sowellis explains.
Which is why I love David Wojnarowicz's jacket so much. He wore it to an ACT UP demonstration at the height of the AIDS pandemic in '88. It's an act of design, it's art, it's a gesture of making public, but I would say it's an urgent artifact that contains the potential for radical action within it. It's less the work of a specific artist who publishes than it is the plea of a political subject struggling in illness. He died of the disease, I think about 4 years later, struggling in this illness against state negligence for communal responsibility and care. It's a call to action.
For those who haven't heard of Paul Sowellis, I recommend watching his Urgent Craft presentation recorded for the Hofmitz-Milken Center for Typography in 2020. You'll find a link to that, and I think there's also slides from the presentation on the Are.na channel, which the link will be circulated via Canvas. So just to give you a bit of background, Sowellis is current department head and associate professor of graphic design at Rhode Island School of Design. His project work fuses urgent concerns with design and publishing. Shown here is the result of a residency Sowellis undertook at the Internet Archive, sifting material freshly released from copyright and into the public realm for diverse and seldom heard queer voices, and then republishing them for display. So the outcome of his residency at the Internet Archive was this sort of loose assemblage, which was a publication And then this assemblage was also exhibited within a room at the Internet Archive. Most recently, Sir Ellis has helped initiate a residency program of his own invention. Queer.archive.work is an independent space based on Rhode Island that houses a library, a publishing studio, and the aforementioned residency program available to young queer creatives to further investigate their own practices, but also to be able to publish material which then can also be fed into the library of the Queer Archive Work organization. So we come to this question of what is queer typography? This question is something Sir Ellis has been concerned with recently, particularly in looking at the work of practitioners such as Nat Piper and Genderfail. Protest has been identified as a key source for research into and around design activism and typography, but what other avenues should be included under this umbrella? And how is examining typography relevant and helpful in queering the design canon? And these are some spreads from a risograph edition of a presentation that Sir Ellis has made. In a research document titled What is Queer Typography, Sir Ellis examines RMIT alumni Dennis Grail's thoughts around typography and typeface design and its mode of practice. Dennis makes some pertinent points, but Sir Ellis ponders if Dennis's suggestions are queering, or rather a reorganization of existing models. Is reorganization queering? Does this go far enough? And sort of leading to this question of what does it mean to queer something, especially something as encased and molded by rigid systems and structures as typography, or indeed more broadly graphic design in general. Perhaps it is finding out that becomes more fruitful in these cases. And perhaps it is spending time in the messy liminal spaces that loiter around the margins of established and widely accepted ideas of design, and design's legacy or canon, that not only yield exciting developments, but can also make room for creative voices previously excluded from familiar dialogues. Maybe the point is to avoid what Sir Ellis terms smooth readings of design, or in the words of theoretician Donna Haraway, maybe a best tactic is to be sure to stay with the trouble. Thank you for listening, for taking the time to follow this presentation. Just a reminder that a secure link to a Are.na channel will be shared containing many of the references that were presented as part of this presentation. Thanks.
Because they will try to convince us that we have arrived, that we are already there, that it has happened. Because we need to live in the place where we are truly alive, present, safe, and accounted for. Because we refuse to allow our writing, songs, art, activism, and political histories to be suppressed or stolen. Because we refuse to be embarrassed about the mistakes and faults and choose to move forward with a political agenda bent on the freedom of all. I get it, I get it, I get it. I get it, I get it, I get it. Try to get it, I get it, I get it. Try to get it, I get it, I get it. Try to get it, I get it, I get it. Try to get it, I get it, I get it. Try to get it, I get it, I get it. I get it, I get it.